It's a bit of a complex ride, but you're going to have to come along for the ride with me because Passport Gate has the Netherlands absolutely in a chokehold. Okay, we've got a situation where a problem that I'd identified in terms of Indian football is actually affecting the Netherlands. And it's because a lot of countries, and this is very strange to me, but a lot of countries have a rule that you can only have citizenship in that country, right? And if you get citizenship in another country, you have to get rid of the passport. And why does this affect Dutch football? Well, it turns out, a couple of these countries are India, China, right? These are countries that if you have one nationality, you cannot get another one. It's why the Indian national team doesn't recruit dual nationals from the English lower leagues that have Indian descent, because they would have to literally give up their British passport, right? There are interviews with British players that have, an Indian parent or two Indian parents or whatever, where they could go. And then, of course, you can imagine the effect this would have on the Pakistan national team, on maybe like Bangladesh, right? Like these national teams would be able to build themselves up by recruiting dual nationals. Was not possible, right? Because obviously in the UK, then they would have to get a work permit because they would be Indian citizens or Pakistani citizens or whatever. They wouldn't actually be citizens of the UK. But this is known. It's understood around Indian and Chinese players, right? Chinese players, they're going to come over, but you can't, it's part of the reason why these guys aren't able to come and play in Europe at all. Because they're just, whether it's work permit rules or non-EU rules or whatever happens to be the situation in that league, they don't have the opportunity to come and play in the league. So it's a known thing in a lot of places. But what I didn't know is that the Netherlands is actually one of those countries. You can only have Dutch citizenship. If you have Dutch citizenship, you have to give it up in order to take citizenship somewhere else. So that's obviously a big decision. But the Netherlands is an incredibly diverse country. Like really, really diverse. As you probably noticed, a solid number of the members of the Moroccan national team, the Indonesian national team, and there are players on a lot of national teams that were born and kind of developed in the Netherlands. Now, who does this not affect? Curacao. Curacao is part of the Kingdom of the Netherlands, and so you can be a Curaçaoan representative and keep your Dutch citizenship because it's literally a part of like the legal entity that is the Netherlands. But let's take a look at another team, Suriname. The Surinamese national team. Now, Suriname is fully independent. They made the World Cup playoff this year. They've gotten a lot better. But this is an issue that's affecting Surinamese players, Indonesian players, Moroccan players. Because if you choose to play for one of those national teams, it had been something that was kind of ignored, apparently. It had been something that was kind of ignored up to this point, because this isn't necessarily new. Suriname and Indonesia have gotten more aggressive with their ability to recruit dual nationals that grow up in the Netherlands. That's obviously contributed to Indonesia making the last round of Asian qualifying and being in it to the end. Suriname making the World Cup playoff, right? These teams have gotten better because they've got a pool of players that has the advantage of growing up in one of the best academy systems in the world in the Netherlands. But it's been happening for a while. Morocco is probably the oldest national team to really use this. It's not a new thing. It's a newer thing, but these national teams are working on a geological time period, right? This is Suriname over the last 10 years has been recruiting these guys, and now their team is decent. Indonesia over the last 10 years has been recruiting these guys, and now has enough of them in the system that they're decent or whatever. But somehow in the last 10 years, nobody ever thought to look at the actual registration rules of what's going on in the Netherlands. And that is insane to me. Because no offense to Indian football, it's not the biggest thing ever. But I've read multiple news articles about how India is holding itself back with that law. That you can't have dual nationality. That they could, write some law that opens it up basically for sports people. That if you want to represent India athletically, you can get some sort of waiver. Or there are a lot of, but there's been philosophical discussions around India and to a lesser extent China that I've run into about how to actually make this whole process work in a country that only wants, one passport, which I don't understand to begin with. I mean, we live in a pretty global world, right? I think there's a lot of people, particularly in Europe, but in the entire world, that can and probably should have citizenship in multiple countries. They have, obviously that can raise certain questions about, taxes and whatever. But those are questions we're going to have to figure out how to answer because the world's not getting bigger anytime soon. It's getting smaller. All right, so more dual nationality, more mobility of just human beings in general. Like, in a sense, I feel like if you're a country that has just a singular, like you can only have this passport, I feel like it's going to probably change eventually. I don't know. There's probably a lot of legalese and logical reasons for it, but it's very clear that a lot of countries allow dual nationality, and you can have that citizenship, and other citizenships in those countries haven't burst into flames, not mine notwithstanding. But they basically have this situation where the Dutch leagues have registration rules. One of them is that you have to pay 600,000 euros in annual wages to a player from a country outside the European Union. Suriname and Indonesia, last I checked, are not in the European Union. Neither is Morocco, which means the moment that these players join this other national team, which I think is cool and great and good for the game and whatever, the moment they do that, they become huge financial burdens for their clubs, particularly not the big 4 or 5 clubs in the Netherlands, but everybody else. They're not really want to get, the starting left back for Indonesia is not somebody that's going to be commanding 600,000 euros a year, you would think. Or the starting midfielder for Suriname's not necessarily a guy that's going to be at that level. But how did this start? This started because, all right, I got to scroll up here. Following a 6-0 loss in the Eredivisie to Go Ahead Eagles, NAC Breda lodged an appeal with the KNVB, which is the Dutch FA, alleging that Go Ahead Eagles fielded an ineligible player and that it should be replayed. The player was Dean James, who's the left back, and he had his Indonesian nationality as of March 2025. He's played 5 games for Indonesia. Now, Indonesia is another country where you can only have Indonesian citizenship. So he's double blocked, basically. He's obviously not a Dutch citizen. He can only be an Indonesian citizen if he's playing for Indonesia. And yet that transition happened after he entered the Dutch FA as a Dutch citizen. And so Go Ahead Eagles wins this game playing Dean James, and then all of a sudden NAC Breda comes around and says, wait a second, we're going to appeal. Right? So I am stunned, again, that this is what it took in order for this to happen. I feel like somebody should have been in the saddle making decisions at the Dutch FA a while ago. This train was obvious. This was coming down the tracks, Mach 5, Mach 10. You got people talking about it all over the place. You like Rafael van der Vaart talking about Moroccans are not good enough for the Dutch team, choose Morocco, right? This was not a conversation that wasn't in the eye of the Dutch sporting public. And yet somehow the Dutch FA just seems very unprepared for this because NAC Breda has shown up with pretty obvious facts, basically saying, look, this guy's an Indonesian citizen. He's not a Dutch citizen. He played in this game, but he's registered improperly. Basically saying we should be able to replay this game because they used an ineligible player who under the FA rules is not eligible. And then following suit, other teams started to appeal as well. Second tier side Topos followed NAC's example and lodged an appeal after their 3-1 loss to Willem II. They're unsure about defender and Indonesian international Nathan Joaan, who switched citizenship in 2024. So the result of this is that this process isn't going to be quick for some reason. Right? The FA is going to have to review everything and figure out, what the best recourse is. The result is that none of these guys are playing in the meantime. Because the moment that these started to drop, every team that has a Surinamese, a Moroccan guy, right, every team that has one of those guys that's not properly registered as such, there's a lot of them just stopped playing them. And so all of them are just iced out. Obviously a super shitty situation, not just for the players, but also for the teams. Because if you've got a guy who's your starting center back or left back or whatever, and now all of a sudden you're just going, we don't want to get in more trouble. If we end up getting fined, if we end up having to replay these matches or whatever, we don't want to get in more trouble. So until we know the decision, we're not going to play this guy. You now have a bunch of guys that, in my opinion, through the incompetency of the FA by not anticipating this problem, by not seeing this coming sooner, or addressing this with some sort of loophole, like, look, if you enter the Dutch league system as a Dutch citizen, then it's okay. But then how are you going to be able to uphold that in the courts? Because obviously the bylaws when those players joined wouldn't have said that. You know, like it's just so annoying and bureaucratic. And it's just a bunch of teams trying to win matches. So they're all very aggressively going to lawyer up and go after each other. And in the meantime, these players just can't play. They're not playing. None of them are playing. Now, they got a professor of sociology and law, Tesselte de Lang, who I'm very sorry, I know I said that wrong, said if they're still playing for a Dutch club, this constitutes illegal employment. Those clubs could be fined by the labor inspectorate for this. So this is like illegal and hold on, my air conditioning's making a lot of noise. This is like a legal immigration issue and a legal employment issue that goes beyond football, right? Because you'd love to just be able to say, look, you know, from a footballing sense, these guys were developed, they're going to stay Dutch, right? But you have to deal with the laws of the actual country. But then there's the question of like the actual staffing of these agencies. And the person said the labor inspectorate and the Immigration and Naturalization Service are severely overburdened and understaffed. I can imagine that these agencies have other priorities. Perhaps at the IND, they think, let those lads get on with it. We're busy with asylum seekers, which makes sense, right? This is kind of the logic of the situation taking hold. But the problem is football clubs want to win so bad, they're not going to go with the logic. They're literally going to start suing each other in order to try and figure out whether a player is legal or whether a player is illegal. They're just going to start throwing shit at each other to, you know, eventually this is going to get hashed out. Because these leagues and the rules that hold these leagues together are surprisingly tenuous, right? And there is no part of that rule system and point system and registration system that has any wiggle room in any one of these leagues. And we have just discovered a massive loophole that is basically dependent on reporting and like the government caring enough to do something. Well, the FA should have cared enough to do something. This, in my opinion, falls entirely on the FA's plate. I know I already said that. The option that this guy proposes is you could either have them give up their passports and become Dutch citizens again, which obviously would suck for those national teams. And, you know, they've been playing for these national teams in some cases for 5 or 6 years that appear in just this story. The third option, though, is her favorite. So it would be good if the Netherlands amended the law and made an exception for this category of athletes so that they do not lose their Dutch passports if they start playing for another country. We're waiting for a minister or MP to propose amending the law to sort this out. And again, in the meantime, these guys are just not playing, hanging out. Really dumb situation. Wish logic could prevail here. Like, these guys, they should be able to have dual nationality. Even if you don't want to give dual nationality to everybody, it's a sporting, whatever.